Nobody expected Frank Costello to show up to his own funeral. October 15, 1934. St. Patrick's Cathedral was packed with every crime boss, politician, and judge in New York. They'd all come to pay respects to the man who supposedly died in a warehouse fire 3 days earlier. But when the church doors opened at 10:47 a.m., Frank Costello walked down the center aisle in a charcoal gray suit, perfectly alive and absolutely furious. What happened next didn't just shock the 500 mourners. It ended a war before it started and made Frank the most feared man in New York. The setup had been perfect. Too perfect. On October 12th, Frank's warehouse on the Hudson River had exploded in a fireball that could be seen from Manhattan. The fire department found a charred body inside, identified through dental records as Francesco Castiglia. The newspapers ran obituaries. The police closed their files. Even Frank's own men believed their boss was dead. But Frank Costello hadn't been in that warehouse. He'd been in Atlantic City, meeting with Meyer Lansky about their expanding casino operations. The body in the warehouse belonged to Vincent Scarface Torino, a small-time hood who'd been skimming money from Frank's numbers operation. Vincent had been lured to the warehouse by promises of a big score. Instead, he got a bullet to the head in a gasoline shower. The man behind the elaborate fake murder was Anthony Three Fingers Marconi, Frank's most trusted lieutenant for 8 years. Marconi had been planning this coup for months, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate his boss and take over a criminal empire worth millions. Frank had suspected Marconi's betrayal for weeks. Small things at first. Meetings Marconi forgot to mention, money that didn't add up, loyal soldiers who suddenly started asking strange questions about Frank's whereabouts and daily routines. But Frank needed proof before he acted, and he needed to send a message that would prevent future betrayals. So Frank let Marconi think his plan had worked. For 3 days, Frank remained hidden in a safe house in Queens while Marconi moved to consolidate power. Marconi held meetings with rival families, promising them pieces of Frank's territory in exchange for recognition as the new boss. He recruited soldiers with promises of better pay and more respect. He even started moving into Frank's penthouse apartment on Central Park West. But Marconi made one crucial mistake. He decided to hold Frank's funeral. The funeral was Marconi's way of making the transition official, by gathering every important figure in New York's underworld and having them pay respects to Frank's memory. Marconi would establish himself as the legitimate successor. It was a brilliant political move if Frank had actually been dead. Frank learned about the funeral from Tommy the Fish Maroney, one of his most loyal soldiers who'd refused to accept Marconi's leadership. At 6 a.m. on October 15th, Tommy knocked on the door of Frank's safe house with urgent news. "Boss, you ain't gonna believe this. Marconi's holding your funeral today. St. Patrick's Cathedral, las 11 a.m. He's invited everyone: Luciano, Lansky, Anastasia, even the judges and police commissioners you had on payroll." Frank was eating breakfast, scrambled eggs, black coffee, and the morning newspapers that all carried stories about his death. He set down his coffee cup and smiled, not a happy smile. The kind of smile that made smart men nervous and stupid men dead. "Is that so?" Frank said quietly. "Well then, I suppose I better make an appearance." At 10:30 a.m., Frank Costello stood across the street from St. Patrick's Cathedral, watching hundreds of New York's most powerful men file into the church, police commissioners who'd taken his money, judges who'd dismissed charges against his operations, crime bosses who'd supposedly been his allies, all of them attending his funeral, ready to divide up his empire. Frank adjusted his tie, straightened his fedora, and crossed the street. He walked up the cathedral steps like he owned them, which, in many ways, he did. Frank had made substantial donations to St. Patrick's over the years, and Cardinal Hayes owed him several favors. The church was magnificent. Soaring Gothic arches, stained glass windows that caught the morning light, an altar that could inspire even the most hardened criminal. But Frank's attention was focused on the crowd. 500 men, representing every aspect of New York's power structure, all gathered to bury him. At the front of the church sat a closed casket, draped with flowers. Expensive flowers. Marconi wasn't being cheap with his performance. Surrounding the casket were the most important crime bosses in America: Lucky Luciano, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky. Men who controlled territories from Boston to Miami. And there, in the front pew, where Frank's widow should have been sitting, was Anthony Three Fingers Marconi, dressed in black, playing the role of grieving lieutenant to perfection. Father O'Malley was just beginning the service when the church doors opened. Every head turned toward the sound. The massive oak doors swung inward with the weight of destiny, and Frank Costello stepped into view. The silence was absolute. 500 men, many of them killers, all frozen in shock. Frank had seen surprise before, but this was different. This was the silence of men who thought they were seeing a ghost. Frank began walking down the center aisle. His footsteps echoed against the stone floors. Step, 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 each footfall like a judge's gavel, marking time until justice was served. Halfway down the aisle, Frank stopped and addressed the congregation. "Gentlemen," his voice carried clearly through the cathedral, "I appreciate you all coming to my funeral. Very thoughtful. But I'm afraid there's been a mistake." Marconi had gone white as the altar cloth. Lucky Luciano was staring with his mouth open. Albert Anastasia's hand moved toward his jacket, then stopped when he realized where he was. Frank continued walking until he reached the front of the church. He stood beside the casket and placed one hand on the polished wood. "This coffin doesn't belong to me," Frank said conversationally. "It belongs to Vincent Torino." Poor Vincent thought he was going to rob my warehouse. Instead, he became the star of this little production. Frank's eyes moved across the front row, making contact with each crime boss. "I know what you're all thinking. How did Frank survive? How did he know? How did he turn the tables?" Frank smiled. "The answer is simple. I've been 3 steps ahead of Anthony Marconi since the day he decided to betray me." Marconi finally found his voice. "Frank, I can explain." "No need to explain. Anthony, I understand perfectly." Frank's tone remained calm, almost friendly. "You wanted my organization. You wanted my territory. You wanted my power, so you decided to kill me and take it all." Frank reached into his jacket. Every armed man in the church tensed, but Frank pulled out not a gun but a small recording device, one of the new electronic innovations that were just becoming available to men with the right connections. "Fortunately for me, you're not as smart as you think you are." Frank pressed a button on the device, and Marconi's voice filled the cathedral. "Once Costello's dead, we divide up his territory 3 ways. You get the gambling operations, I get the docks, and Torino gets the numbers racket. But first, we gotta make sure everyone believes Frank is really gone. That's why we need the funeral." The recording continued for 30 seconds, laying out the entire conspiracy in Marconi's own words. When it ended, Frank looked around the church. Anthony recorded this conversation himself, thinking it would help him organize the coup. What he didn't know was that I'd had his office bugged for 6 months. Frank's voice hardened. What he also didn't know was that Vincent Torino was working for me. Every detail of the betrayal, every plan, every meeting, I knew about it all. Lucky Luciano stood up slowly. "Frank, we didn't know. Marconi told us you were dead. We came to pay respects." "I know, Charlie, no hard feelings." Frank's expression softened slightly when he looked at Luciano. "But there are some people here who did know. Some people who were promised pieces of my territory in exchange for supporting Anthony's takeover." Frank's eyes swept the church, and several men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Judge Morrison, you were promised favorable rulings on waterfront cases. Captain O'Brien, you were going to get double your usual payment for ignoring dock activities. Commissioner Walsh, Anthony promised you complete control over police investigations in Lower Manhattan." Each man Frank named went pale as he spoke their names and detailed their treachery. Frank had done his homework thoroughly. "Here's what's going to happen," Frank announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "Judge Morrison, you're going to retire from the bench within 30 days. Captain O'Brien, you're requesting a transfer to Staten Island traffic detail. Commissioner Walsh, going to discover you have a passion for small-town police work in upstate New York." Frank paused, letting this sink in. "Anyone who objects to these arrangements can discuss it with me privately after the service." No one objected. Frank turned his attention back to Marconi, who was still sitting in the front pew, paralyzed with fear and disbelief. "Anthony, stand up." Marconi stood on shaking legs. "For 8 years, you worked for me. I trusted you with my money, my operations, my secrets. I treated you like family." Frank's voice was quiet, but it carried clearly throughout the church. "And you repaid that trust by trying to murder me. Frank, please, in the old country, there's a tradition for dealing with betrayal. An eye for an eye, a life for a life." Frank reached into his other jacket pocket. This time, he did pull out a gun, a small nickel-plated revolver. "But we're not in the old country, Anthony. We're in America, and in America we believe in giving people choices." Frank held the gun casually, not pointing it at anyone, just letting everyone see it. "Here's your choice, Anthony. Option 1, you leave New York tonight. You take the $10,000 in the envelope I'm about to give you, and you disappear. You go to California, or Florida, or anywhere else that's not here. You never come back, you never contact anyone you knew here, and you live whatever life you can build for yourself." Marconi's eyes were fixed on the gun. "What's option 2? Frank's smile was colder than a January wind off the Hudson River. "Option 2 is we finish this the old-fashioned way. Right here, right now, in front of 500 witnesses." The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 15, 20. Finally, Marconi spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take option 1. Frank nodded to Tommy Maroney, who stepped forward and handed Marconi a thick envelope. "Train leaves Grand Central at midnight. Be on it." Marconi took the envelope with trembling hands and walked toward the church exit. Every eye in the cathedral followed his retreat. When the doors closed behind him, Frank addressed the congregation one final time. "Gentlemen, this has been educational for all of us, but I want to make something clear. Frank Costello is not dead. Frank Costello is very much alive, and Frank Costello's organization is stronger than ever." Frank holstered his gun and straightened his suit jacket. "Father O'Malley, thank you for the use of your church. The $10,000 donation I promised for the cathedral renovation fund will be delivered tomorrow." Frank walked back down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. At the church doors, he turned back one final time. Oh, and gentlemen, next time someone tells you Frank Costello is dead, I suggest you wait to see the body before you start dividing up the inheritance. Frank walked out of St. Patrick's Cathedral at 11:23 a.m. on October 15, 1934, leaving behind 500 men who would never again underestimate his intelligence, his network, or his capacity for strategic thinking. Anthony Marconi was found 3 days later in a Los Angeles hotel room, dead from what the coroner ruled a heart attack. He was 34 years old. The $10,000 Frank had given him was untouched on the nightstand, along with a one-way train ticket back to New York that had never been used. Within a week, Frank's organization was running more smoothly than ever. The threat of internal betrayal had been eliminated. The corrupt officials who'd planned to switch sides were gone, and every criminal in New York understood that Frank Costello was not a man to be crossed. But the real lesson of October 15th wasn't about power or revenge, it was about information. Frank had survived because he knew about the betrayal before it happened. He turned the tables because he deplanned his response while his enemies thought they'd already won. The story of Frank's funeral became legend in New York's underworld, not just because of the drama or the theatrics, but because it demonstrated something that every criminal needed to understand. In Frank Costello's world, information was more valuable than guns, planning was more important than muscle, and the man who controlled the story controlled everything. Frank Costello had walked into his own funeral and walked out as the undisputed king of New York, and he'd done it without firing a single shot, because sometimes the most powerful weapon a man can carry is the truth.